My fiancé Leo grabbed my arm, his voice a low, urgent whisper in my ear. "Don't open it. Rebecca, whatever you do not open that door." I could feel his tension, a rigid line of steel against my back. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I'd been watching a movie, curled up on the couch, when the doorbell chimed, a sound so out of place in our quiet evening that it felt like a gunshot. Through the peephole, their faces were distorted, fish-eyed and pleading. The woman's hair was a mess of greying strands, the man's face a road map of weary lines. They were the ghosts of people I once knew, faces I hadn't seen in 15 years. My hand, slick with a sudden cold sweat, froze on the doorknob, and Leo was right. Opening that door was simultaneously the single worst and absolute best decision of my life, because while it unleashed a torrent of chaos and pain, it also saved me. It set me free. My story, or at least the part that matters, really begins when I was 16. Up until then, I was just a kid trying to navigate the choppy waters of a household that felt more like a business arrangement than a family. My parents, as I was biologically obligated to call them, were masters of emotional transaction. Love was a commodity, affection was a reward for compliance, and I was, to put it mildly, a bad investment. I was too quiet, too studious, too prone to asking inconvenient questions like, why does my brother get a new car for his C+ average when I have to beg for a bus pass for my straight A's? Or, why did you tell your friends I won that art scholarship when you secretly threw the acceptance letter in the trash? My brother Jason was the golden child, the sun around which their world revolved. He could do no wrong, and I, it seemed, could do no right. I wasn't a rebellious teenager. I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, I didn't sneak out. My grand crime was that I saw them for what they were, and I wasn't good at hiding it. The final straw, the event that severed the frayed cord of our familial bond, was laughably minor. I refused to give my college savings, money I had earned myself working a greasy diner job, to Jason so he could fix the fender on his brand new car after he drunkenly sideswiped a mailbox. The indignation in my mother's eyes was a sight to behold. She said I was selfish. My father said I had a cruel streak. They told me I didn't understand the meaning of family. A week later, they announced they were going on a trip, a second honeymoon, to reconnect. They packed 2 large suitcases, kissed a confused Jason goodbye, and told me to water the plants. They never came back. No note, no phone call, no forwarding address. They just vanished. For the first few days, I was just numb. I went to school, came home, did my homework, and watered the stupid ferns. Jason was mostly out with his friends. On day 5, the power was shut off. That's when the panic started to set in. On day 7, my mother's sister, my Aunt Carol, showed up. She and my mother had been estranged for years, a fact my mother blamed on Carol's judgmental attitude. Carol took one look at me, gaunt and terrified in the dark, silent house, and her face, usually so stern and composed, crumpled. She didn't ask questions, not then. She just wrapped me in a hug that smelled of lavender and expensive perfume and said the 5 words that saved my life. "You're coming home with me." And just like that, I had a parent. Life with Aunt Carol was a revelation. It was quiet, it was stable, and for the first time, it was safe. Her house wasn't just a structure of wood and plaster, it was a sanctuary. Carol was a formidable woman. She had built a highly successful tech consulting firm from the ground up, in an era when the industry was a boys' club with a capital B. She was sharp, fiercely intelligent, and had a no-nonsense attitude that many found intimidating. But with me, she was endlessly patient. She taught me about stocks and bonds, how to change a tire, how to negotiate a contract, and how to make the perfect beef Wellington. She never once raised her voice to me. She didn't have to. Her approval was something I sought, not out of fear, but out of a deep, abiding respect. We never talked much about my parents. In the beginning, she hired a private investigator, but the trail went cold almost immediately. It was as if they had intentionally scrubbed themselves from existence. "They made their choice, Rebecca," she told me once, her voice firm but her eyes soft. "Now you have to make yours. You can let their absence define you, or you can build a life so full and bright that their shadows can't reach it." I chose the latter. I graduated high school with honors, went to college on a full scholarship that Carol insisted on supplementing with a generous living stipend, and earned my MBA. I met Leo in my final year, a kind, steady man with a laugh that made my chest feel warm and a gaze that made me feel seen. He was an architect, a builder of things, and he loved that I was building my own life, from the blueprint Carol had helped me draw. When I brought him home to meet Carol, she grilled him for an hour straight about everything from his 5-year plan to his opinion on zoning laws. At the end of it, she gave a single, curt nod. Later that night, she pulled me aside and said, "He's a good one. He sees your strength, not your history." That was the highest praise she could offer. I went to work at her firm, starting at the bottom and working my way up, determined to prove I was worthy of the chance she had given me, and I was happy, truly happy. The ghosts of my past had receded, becoming faint whispers in the back of my mind, a story that felt like it had happened to someone else. Then Carol got sick. It was a slow, cruel decline, a battle she fought with the same ferocity she had applied to her business career. I became her primary caregiver, a role I embraced with a devotion that felt like a fraction of what I owed her. For 2 years, my world shrank to the size of her bedroom. We talked for hours about her life, my future, the company. She made sure all her affairs were in order, her will ironed out and indisputable. She was the sole owner of her company, her portfolio was vast, and her estate was considerable. And she left it all to me. Her passing left a crater in my life, a void that I knew would never truly be filled. The week after the funeral, I was sitting in her lawyer's office, a blur of paperwork and legal jargon, when he mentioned that the transfer of assets, particularly the ownership of the firm, would be noted in a few prominent financial journals. I thought nothing of it at the time. It was a standard procedure. I didn't realize it was a flare, shot up into the sky, signaling my location to predators I had long since forgotten were hunting. The doorbell rang 3 weeks to the day after that meeting. And when I ignored Leo's warning and unlatched the deadbolt, the past came flooding in, smelling of cheap desperation and cloying. Fake remorse. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she threw her arms around me. It was a clumsy, awkward embrace. I stood ramrod straight, my body refusing to reciprocate. "Oh, Rebecca, my baby girl," she wailed, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "We finally found you." My father stood behind her, wringing a worn flat cap in his hands, his face a mask of sorrowful contrition. "We've missed you every single day, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick. The performance was flawless, I had to give them that. They looked the part of prodigal parents, worn down by time and regret. Their clothes were dated, my father's jacket frayed at the cuffs, my mother's shoes scuffed. It was a carefully curated image of hardship, designed to elicit pity. Leo stood behind me, a silent, solid presence at my back, his hand resting protectively on my waist. I could feel his skepticism, a shield against their onslaught of manufactured emotion. I stepped back, disentangling myself from my mother's grasp. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My voice was flat, devoid of the emotion that was churning in my gut. "We saw the notice," my father mumbled, looking at the floor. "About Carol. We are so sorry for your loss, Rebecca. She was a good woman." The way he said her name, like an unfamiliar word, sent a fresh wave of anger through me. They hadn't spoken to her in 20 years. "How did you find me?" "We hired a service," my mother chimed in, wiping her fake tears with the back of her hand. "It took everything we had left, but we had to see you. We had to make things right." They spun a tale of woe and misfortune, a rambling narrative of failed business ventures in a dreary, unnamed town, of illnesses and bad luck, and the constant, gnawing guilt of their terrible mistake. They claimed they had to leave all those years ago for a secret job opportunity that went south, that they had always intended to send for me, but they lost everything and were too ashamed to come back empty-handed. It was a story full of holes, a flimsy narrative designed to cover a 15-year crater of silence. Every instinct I had screamed that this was a lie. But there was a small, treacherous part of me, the 16-year-old girl they had left behind, that wanted to believe it. A part of me that craved the one thing I had never had, parents who wanted me. It was that flicker of stupid, childish hope that made me utter the words I would come to regret. "You can stay. For a few days." Leo's hand tightened on my waist, a silent, desperate warning, but it was too late. The door was open, and the vultures had been invited in. The first few days were a masterclass in manipulation. My mother, whose name was Sarah, though it felt strange to even think it, immediately tried to assume the role of homemaker. She would bustle around the kitchen, a space that was Carol's pride and joy, rearranging spice jars and commenting on my lack of proper cookware. "Oh, honey, you can't live on takeout," she'd say with a saccharine smile, ignoring the fact that I was a more than competent cook, taught by Carol herself. She'd do my laundry, folding my clothes in a way that was just slightly wrong, a subtle assertion of control. My father, David, would wander through the house, touching things with a feigned reverence. He'd run his hand over the polished mahogany of the dining table or stare at Carol's art collection with a look of profound, unearned sadness. "Your aunt had such wonderful taste," he'd sigh. "She always was the classy one in the family." The word family was a weapon, a word they used constantly to try and batter down my defenses. They'd pepper their conversations with it, a constant reminder of the connection I was supposed to feel. "It's just so good to be together as a family again." This is what families do. They support each other. Their attempts to rewrite history were both audacious and insulting. They'd bring up fabricated memories of a happy childhood, of beach vacations we never took, and birthday parties they never threw. "Remember that time we all went to the state fair, Rebecca?" Sarah would ask, her eyes twinkling with false nostalgia. "You were so determined to win that giant stuffed bear." I remembered the state fair. I had gone with a friend's family, after my parents had told me we couldn't afford it, only to find out later they had taken my brother Jason and gone without me. I would just stare at them, my silence, a blank wall they couldn't seem to penetrate. When I did gently push back, mentioning that my memory was different, the gaslighting would begin. "Oh, sweetie, you were so young. Your memory is playing tricks on you. You always were a bit of a dramatic child, weren't you?" David would say with a chuckle, as if my trauma was a cute personality quirk. Leo was my sanity. Every night we would retreat to our bedroom, and I would unload the day's absurdities. She told me today that I get my artistic talent from her. I fumed one night, pacing the floor. The woman who told me art was a waste of time and threw out my portfolio. Leo would just listen, his expression calm and steady. "Did you see the watch he's wearing?" Leo asked quietly. "It's a Swiss brand. Retails for at least $5,000. Not bad for someone who supposedly has nothing left." He was right. I started to notice the little things. The expensive, albeit worn, leather of their shoes. The way my mother's hands, which she claimed were ruined from years of hard labor, were perfectly manicured. The way they spoke to each other when they thought I wasn't listening, their voices dropping the sorrowful act and becoming sharp, clipped, and strategic. The charade was starting to fray at the edges. The pressure to talk about the inheritance began subtly. It started with praise for Carol. "She must have been so organized," David would muse, "to build all this and have a plan for it." Then came the probes about my own capabilities. "It must be so overwhelming for you, dear," Sarah would say, placing a cold hand on my arm. "Running a big company, managing all these assets, it's a lot for one person to handle." They were circling, testing my defenses, looking for a way in. They weren't just here for a reunion. They were here for a payday. The pressure intensified in the second week. It was no longer a subtle probe, but a full-on campaign. The topic of the will became a recurring dinner table conversation. It was always framed as concern for me and a desire to honor Carol's legacy. "We'd just feel so much better if we understood the structure of the estate," David said one evening, pushing mashed potatoes around his plate. "As your parents, we feel a responsibility to help you navigate this. We have experience in business, you know." His claim of business experience was so ludicrous I almost choked on my water. The story they had spun was one of relentless failure. It was the first time they had slipped, revealing a crack in their carefully constructed narrative of victimhood. Leo caught it too, his eyes meeting mine across the table in a silent exchange. "What kind of business?" Leo asked, his tone one of polite curiosity. David faltered for a second. "Oh, you know, consulting," he said vaguely. "General strategies. It was a tough market. My mother quickly jumped in to change the subject, launching into a long, meandering story about a leaky roof in their supposed rundown apartment. It was a clumsy deflection, and it set off alarm bells. My role in their narrative was that of the fragile, grieving daughter, too overwhelmed by her newfound responsibilities to cope. They treated me like a child, offering unsolicited advice on everything from how I should dress for board meetings to which investments I should liquidate. "You should really sell off those tech stocks, Rebecca," David advised, despite having no knowledge of the portfolio. "They're too volatile. Real estate is the only safe bet." The implication was clear. I was incapable, and they were the seasoned experts who had arrived just in time to save me from myself. Their true goal, however, was the company. Carol's company was her life's work, a thriving, innovative firm that I was now proudly leading. To them, it was just a cash cow waiting to be milked. "You know, sweetheart," Sarah began one afternoon, cornering me in the study, "your father and I were thinking, it would be a wonderful tribute to Carol if we made the company a true family business. We could help you run it. Your father could be a co-president. It would take so much pressure off you." The sheer audacity of it left me speechless. They wanted to waltz in after 15 years of silence and take control of the legacy Carol had entrusted to me. The suggestion was wrapped in the language of love and support, but it felt like a hostile takeover. It was also when I realized they didn't see me. They didn't see the woman who had cared for her dying aunt, who had earned an MBA, who was now the CEO of a successful company. They saw the 16-year-old girl they had abandoned, a pawn to be moved around, a chessboard of their own design. Leo, meanwhile, was becoming more than just a supportive partner. He was becoming an investigator. He was quiet and methodical, spending his evenings on his laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. When I asked what he was doing, he'd just say, "Just connecting a few dots." He was a man who built things, and he recognized demolition when he saw it. He knew my parents weren't here to build a new relationship with me. They were here to tear down everything Carol and I had built. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like occupied territory. Their presence was a constant, suffocating weight. I found myself retreating to my home office, the one space they seemed hesitant to invade, and locking the door. The peace Carol had given me was being systematically dismantled, and I knew I had to do something before it was gone for good. The emotional toll was staggering. I was sleeping in 4-hour increments, waking up with my jaw aching from grinding my teeth. During the day, I'd walk through the halls of my own home feeling like an intruder. My parents had a way of expanding to fill any space, their cheap floral perfume and my father's musky cologne clinging to the air, a constant olfactory assault. Their voices, one a cloying whine, the other a booming, false baritone, echoed from room to room. I started avoiding them, taking calls in the garden or working late at the office just to have a few hours of peace. This, of course, was used as another tool against me. "You're working so hard, Rebecca," my mother would say, her voice dripping with faux concern. "You're going to burn yourself out. That's why we're here, to help you carry the load." The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. They weren't a help, they were the load. They were a 200-pound weight strapped to my back, and I was starting to buckle. My performance at work began to suffer. I was distracted during meetings, my mind drifting back to the latest passive-aggressive comment or historical revisionism that had occurred over breakfast. My team, who had known and respected Carol for years, noticed the change. My COO, a sharp woman named Maria, who had been Carol's right hand, pulled me aside one day. "Is everything all right, Rebecca?" she asked, her gaze direct but kind. "You seem distant." I wanted to tell her everything, to unload the whole sordid story, but I was so deeply ashamed. Admitting that my own parents had abandoned me and were now back to stake a claim on my inheritance felt like a personal failing, as if their toxicity was a contagion I was carrying. So I just shook my head and muttered something about grieving, a half-truth that felt like a lie. The gaslighting was relentless, and it was starting to work. I found myself questioning my own memories, my own sanity. Was I being too harsh? Had I misremembered the callousness of their departure? Their version of events was so consistent, so practiced, that it was like an acid drip on my own certitude. They were experts at making me feel like the unreasonable one. "We were just trying to protect you from our struggles," my father would say, his eyes welling up on cue. It would have broken our hearts for you to see us fail. They framed their abandonment as a noble sacrifice, a painful decision made for my own good. They were the martyrs, and I was the ungrateful child, judging them for a choice they had made out of love. It was a psychological masterstroke, and I was falling for it. I was in a fog, a state of constant emotional exhaustion. Leo's steady presence was the only thing keeping me anchored. He never wavered in his belief that they were con artists. He started making a list, a simple document on his laptop titled Inconsistencies. He logged every slip of the tongue, every expensive item he spotted, every story that didn't add up. It was his way of holding on to the facts, of creating a rational counter-narrative to their emotional barrage. They said they came here from a town called Northwood, he told me one night, scrolling through his notes. There are 3 Northwoods in a 500-mile radius. None of them have any public records of a David or Sarah Miller living there in the past 15 years. I checked. His words were a splash of cold water. He was dealing in facts while I was drowning in feelings. It was a turning point. I realized they were relying on my emotional response, on my lingering childhood desire for parental love, to cloud my judgment. They were banking on me being too heartbroken and confused to see the truth. That night, I decided to stop feeling and start thinking. I needed proof. I needed to fight them, not with emotion, but with facts, just like Leo was doing. The 16-year-old victim was finally ready to get angry. My anger, when it finally arrived, wasn't a hot, explosive rage. It was a cold, quiet fury. It settled deep in my bones, a core of ice that clarified my thoughts and sharpened my senses. The fog of confusion and guilt began to dissipate, replaced by a crystalline, righteous indignation. I started playing their game, but I was playing to win. I agreed to a meeting with my father to discuss the company's future. We sat in Carol's study, a room filled with her strength and intelligence, and I felt her presence like a hand on my shoulder. I put on the mask of the dutiful, overwhelmed daughter they wanted to see. I let my shoulders slump, I kept my voice soft, and I asked him questions, feigning ignorance about corporate governance and financial planning. David puffed up like a peacock, reveling in his perceived position of power. He pontificated about market trends and diversification strategies, using business jargon he clearly didn't understand. It was like listening to a child describe a space shuttle launch using words they'd overheard on television. He talked about synergy and leveraging assets and optimizing verticals. It was all meaningless corporate speak, but he delivered it with the unshakable confidence of a true conman. The first thing we need to do, he said, leaning forward conspiratorially, is a full audit of the company's liabilities, and for that, I'll need access to the primary accounts. Just to get a clear picture, you understand. There it was, the first direct move for control. He wasn't asking for a summary or a report, he was asking for the keys to the kingdom. I just nodded slowly. That makes sense, I said, my voice betraying none of the revulsion I felt. Let me talk to the company's lawyer and see what the protocol is for that. His face fell for a fraction of a second, the flicker of disappointment so fast I would have missed it if I hadn't been looking for it. He had expected me to just hand over the login credentials. The mention of a lawyer, of protocol, was an unexpected obstacle. Oh, there's no need to get lawyers involved at this stage, he said quickly, waving a dismissive hand. This is a family matter. We can keep it informal. Of course, I replied with a small smile. But Carol always taught me to follow procedure. She'd want everything done by the book. Using Carol's name was a strategic move. It was a name they couldn't argue with, a legacy they claimed to respect. It boxed him in, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Leo's investigation was yielding more results. He had moved beyond simple public record searches and was now digging into social media archives and old news articles. He was an architect. He knew how to find the blueprints of people's lives. He found a digital footprint, faint but undeniable. He discovered a lifestyle blog my mother had apparently run for a couple of years under a pseudonym. It was full of posts about her love for high-end fashion, gourmet food, and luxury travel. The dates of the posts corresponded with the years they were supposedly destitute and struggling. There were pictures of her, face partially obscured by a large sun hat or a cleverly angled wine glass, but it was unmistakably her. In one photo, she was wearing a designer dress on a yacht. The caption read, "Living our best life, far from the drama." That single sentence was a gut punch. My drama. The life they had abandoned me to. While I was terrified and alone, they were living their best life. The cold fury in my gut solidified into something harder, something sharper. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about justice. This was for the 16-year-old girl who had to eat canned beans in a dark house, wondering why her parents had thrown her away like trash. Armed with the knowledge from the blog, my perception shifted. I started seeing everything through a new lens, and the pieces of the puzzle began to snap into place. Their worn-out clothes weren't a sign of poverty. They were a costume. Their beat-up sedan, which they'd parked down the street to make a show of walking up to the house, was a prop. This entire production was a meticulously staged play, and I was the unwitting audience. I decided to set a small trap. I knew from the blog that my mother had a particular fondness for a very exclusive, very expensive brand of Italian handbag. It was her holy grail, mentioned in at least 3 different posts. I casually mentioned to Leo at breakfast, knowing they were listening from the next room, that I was thinking of selling some of Carol's designer bags, as they weren't really my style. "There's one in particular," I said, loud enough for my voice to carry. "A vintage piece from that Italian designer Sarah loves so much, the auction house thinks it could go for $30,000. I had invented the bag, of course. Carol's tastes were classic and understated. But I knew my mother wouldn't know that. There was a clatter of a coffee cup from the dining room, followed by a hushed, frantic whisper. That afternoon, my mother approached me, her face a mask of casual indifference. "You know, Rebecca," she began, "I was just thinking. Since you're so busy, maybe I could help you sort through some of Carol's things. It must be so emotionally draining for you. I could, organize her closets." It was so transparent it was almost comical. Her eyes, however, held a glint of pure, unadulterated greed. "That's a kind offer," I said, "but I'm not ready to go through her things just yet. It's still too hard." She couldn't hide her flash of irritation. "Well, don't wait too long," she snapped, her sweet facade cracking. "Things like that can lose their value if they're not properly stored." She caught herself, and the sugary smile returned, but the mask had slipped. I had my confirmation. Her motivations were as clear and as ugly as the designer logos she coveted. They were performing a delicate dance, trying to maintain the illusion of loving parents while simultaneously probing for financial weaknesses. They would corner me separately, using a classic good cop, bad cop routine. My father would talk business and strategy, trying to appeal to my logical side. My mother would talk feelings and family, trying to exploit my emotions. "Your father is just so worried about you," she'd say, her lower lip trembling. "He sees so much of himself in you, a brilliant business mind, but he also sees how vulnerable you are. He wants to protect you. Protect me." The word was a bitter poison on her tongue. The only thing they wanted to protect was their access to my inheritance. Their desperation was becoming more apparent. They were running out of time. Their lease on the rental car would be up soon. Their credit cards, as Leo discovered through a paid background check service, were maxed out. The persona of the struggling parents returning to make amends was colliding with the reality of 2 grifters running their final con, and their target was becoming less and more less, a daughter and more a mark. My home, my sanctuary, had become a pressure cooker. Every conversation was layered with subtext, every gesture a calculated move. The tension was thick enough to choke on. I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the final act to begin. I knew a confrontation was inevitable, but I wasn't going to let them control the narrative. This play was going to end on my terms, with a final scene they would never see coming. I was no longer the audience. I was the director. Leo's investigation took a darker turn. He wasn't just finding evidence of a lavish lifestyle. He was uncovering a pattern of deceit that went back decades. Using the names from the background check and the pseudonyms from the blog, he found a string of small claims court judgments against them in 3 different states. They had a history of skipping out on rent, leaving behind angry landlords and unpaid bills. They had started several sham businesses, always some form of consulting, that seemed to exist only to take out loans that were never repaid. They were professional parasites, moving from town to town, host to host, leaving a trail of financial wreckage in their wake. The most damning discovery, however, had to do with my brother, Jason. I hadn't seen or spoken to him since the day they left. I had assumed they had taken him with them, the favored child on their journey to greener pastures. The truth was far more callous. According to a short-lived social media profile Leo found, Jason had been left with our grandmother, my father's mother, just a few months after they had abandoned me. She had passed away 5 years later, and Jason had been shuffled into the foster care system. They hadn't just abandoned me, they had abandoned both of their children. They had shed their responsibilities like a snake sheds its skin, all to pursue a life of selfish, fleeting pleasures. That knowledge changed everything. My cold anger now had a new focus. This wasn't just about what they had done to me, it was about what they had done to Jason, the golden child they had supposedly cherished. Even their favoritism had been a lie, a tool of manipulation that they had discarded as soon as he became an inconvenience. I grieved for him, for the boy who had also been abandoned, albeit with a few months' delay. I felt a surge of protectiveness for the brother I barely knew, a brother who had been just as much a victim as I was. The idea that these two people were sleeping under my roof, eating my food, and plotting to steal my future filled me with a level of revulsion that was physical. It made my skin crawl. I needed them out. But I knew I couldn't just kick them out. They were manipulative enough to twist the story, to paint me as the cruel, ungrateful daughter throwing her poor, repentant parents out onto the street. They would go to the media, to the courts, and while they might not have a legal claim, the scandal could damage the company's reputation, a reputation Carol had spent a lifetime building. I needed undeniable, irrefutable proof of their intentions, something so damning that they would have no choice but to disappear quietly. I needed to find their playbook. Con artists, especially ones as practiced as them, always have a plan. They would have notes, documents, a strategy. They were arrogant enough to believe I was too stupid or too emotionally compromised to ever find it, and that arrogance was going to be their downfall. I started watching them, studying their routines. My father spent most of his time in the guest room, on a burner phone he thought I didn't know about. My mother was more careful, but she had a habit of leaving her oversized purse on the chair in the entryway. But they were always together, a united front. I needed to separate them. The opportunity came in the form of a fake emergency. I had my assistant at work call the house, posing as a representative from a credit card company, claiming my father's card had been flagged for fraud. I told him he needed to go to a specific bank branch downtown to clear it up, a branch I knew was at least a 45-minute drive away. He grumbled, but the fear of losing one of his credit lines was enough to get him out the door. My mother decided to stay behind, likely to keep an eye on me. That was her mistake. I was about to turn the tables on her. With my father gone, a tense, artificial quiet settled over the house. My mother followed me from room to room, making small talk, her presence a constant, nagging pressure. I knew what she was doing. She was making sure I didn't go anywhere near their things. I had to create a diversion, something that would draw her away and give me a window of opportunity. I went into the kitchen and accidentally knocked over a large canister of flour, sending a white cloud billowing into the air and covering the floor in a fine powder. "Oh no!" I cried out, my voice laced with convincing frustration. What a mess. My mother rushed in, her face a mixture of annoyance and feigned sympathy. "Oh, you poor thing, let me help you with that." No, I've got it," I insisted. "But could you do me a huge favor? The main vacuum is in the upstairs hall closet, but the bag is full. There are new bags in the laundry room pantry. It's the blue box on the top shelf." It was a convoluted set of instructions designed to keep her occupied for at least 5 minutes. The laundry room was on the other side of the house from the guest wing where they were staying. She hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave me alone, but the sight of the flour-covered floor and the opportunity to play the role of the helpful mother was too tempting to resist. The second she was out of sight, I moved. I ran, silent as a shadow, down the hall to their guest room. The door was slightly ajar. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a loud drum in the silent house. The room was surprisingly tidy, their sparse belongings neatly put away. It was another part of their act, The image of people who traveled light because they had nothing. I knew it was a lie. I checked the closet first. Nothing but the cheap clothes they wore as their costumes. Under the bed, there was only a dusty emptiness. I moved to the dresser, my fingers flying as I opened each drawer. Socks, underwear, a paperback novel. Nothing. Panic began to bubble in my chest. Where would they hide it? I thought back to their arrival. They had each been carrying a small, worn-out suitcase, but my father had also been carrying a newer-looking black duffel bag, which I hadn't seen since. It wasn't in the closet. It wasn't under the bed. I scanned the room again, my eyes darting everywhere. My gaze landed on a large, antique chest at the foot of the bed, a piece that had been in Carol's family for generations. It was the last place I would have thought to look. I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled among the spare blankets, was the black duffel bag. My hands trembled as I unzipped it. The contents were not the belongings of a destitute couple. Inside were 2 brand new laptops, several smartphones, and a thick leather folio. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the folio. It was exactly what I had been looking for. It was their Bible, their battle plan. The first page was a meticulously researched dossier on me. My education, my career path, my relationship with Leo, even my social media profiles. They had been studying me for months. The next section was a detailed financial profile of my aunt's estate, with assets highlighted and potential revenue streams calculated. But the most chilling part was the last section. It was a script, a scene-by-scene breakdown of their entire performance, from the tearful reunion at the door to their long-term strategy for gaining control of the company. It had dialogue, emotional cues, even contingency plans. There were notes in the margins in my mother's handwriting. Emphasize guilt. Mention Jason to test for weakness. Frame everything as helping Rebecca. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just an opportunistic grab for cash. This was a premeditated, psychologically abusive campaign orchestrated by the 2 people who were supposed to love me most. I heard my mother's footsteps in the hall. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling as I switched to the camera. I photographed every single page, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm of terror and vindication. I shoved the folio back into the bag, lowered the chest lid, and sprinted out of the room, making it back to the flour-dusted kitchen just as my mother walked in, a box of vacuum bags in her hand. "Found them," she said, her voice bright. She hadn't suspected a thing. My own voice, when I thanked her, was surprisingly steady, a calm facade over the raging storm inside me. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I cleaned up the flour, my movements robotic, my mind racing. The images on my phone were a toxic glow in my pocket, a digital confirmation of a betrayal so profound it almost defied comprehension. They hadn't just abandoned me, they had erased me, only to resurrect me as a character in their twisted play, a mark in their long con. My father returned that evening, grumbling about the wasted trip to the bank, and I watched them, truly watched them, for the first time. I saw the subtle glances they exchanged over the dinner table, the slight squeeze of a hand, the almost imperceptible nod. They were a team, a pair of predators working in perfect sync. The love they feigned for me was a performance, but the bond between them, a bond forged in deceit and shared narcissism, was terrifyingly real. That night, I showed the photos to Leo. We sat on our bed, the door locked, and scrolled through the images in silence. His face, usually so open and kind, hardened into a mask of cold fury. He read the notes in the margins, the cold, calculating instructions on how to manipulate my emotions. When he got to the part about mentioning Jason to test for weakness, he let out a low, guttural sound of disgust. "These people are monsters," he said, his voice quiet but shaking with rage. "They're not parents, Rebecca. They're something else entirely." Seeing the evidence laid out, reflected in his horrified eyes, solidified my resolve. There was no more room for doubt, no more lingering whispers of what if. The 16-year-old girl who had craved their approval was gone, and in her place was a woman who was about to burn their entire world to the ground. I now had the proof I needed, but I had to be strategic about how I used it. A simple confrontation would result in more lies, more gaslighting. They would claim I had fabricated the documents, that I was hysterical, that I was the one trying to cheat them. I couldn't just win the argument. I had to utterly and completely dismantle their entire operation, leaving them with no escape route, no plausible deniability. I needed an audience. I needed a witness with authority. The next morning, I called Carol's lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Arthur Vance, who had known me since I was a teenager. "Arthur," I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. "I need to schedule an urgent meeting, here, at the house, and I need you to bring a notary." Arthur, who was not a man given to surprise, paused. "Is everything all right, Rebecca?" "Everything is about to be," I replied. "I'm just cleaning house." I then made one more call to a security company that came highly recommended. I arranged for 2 of their best men to be parked in a discreet vehicle at the end of my driveway at precisely 3:00 p.m. the next day. I was setting a stage, just like they had. But in my play, the villains were about to get a taste of their own medicine. The final act was about to begin, and I had written a truly spectacular ending. The day of the meeting was thick with a strange electric tension. My parents could sense a shift in the atmosphere. My politeness had become brittle, my smiles thin and tight. I was no longer engaging with their charade, instead offering one-word answers and keeping my distance. They watched me with a new wariness, their predator instinct sensing that their prey was no longer behaving as expected. They conferred in hushed whispers, their heads close together, their glances in my direction filled with suspicion. They were trying to figure out what had changed. What new variable had been introduced into their carefully crafted equation? My mother tried to corner me while I was making coffee. "Rebecca, honey, you seem upset," she said, her voice oozing that familiar, fake concern. "Is it the stress of the business? You can talk to us, you know, we're here for you." I just looked at her, my expression unreadable. I saw the lines of calculation around her eyes, the slight twitch of her mouth as she waited for me to break down, to confess some weakness she could exploit. "I'm fine," I said, my voice flat. "Just have a lot on my mind." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, a look of frustration clouding her face. At 2:45 p.m., Arthur Vance's sleek black car pulled into the driveway. He was an imposing figure, tall and dressed in a perfectly tailored grey suit. He carried a leather briefcase that I knew contained more legal firepower than my parents could possibly imagine. With him was a stern-looking woman, the notary, who looked like she had seen and heard everything and was impressed by none of it. I greeted them at the door and led them into the formal dining room. I had set the scene with care. The long mahogany table was polished to a high sheen, reflecting the grim grey light of the afternoon. I took my place at the head of the table, in the chair that had always been Carol's. Arthur sat to my right, the notary to his. Leo stood quietly by the window, his arms crossed, a silent, watchful guardian. I then called for my parents. They entered the room with a sense of unease, their eyes darting from Arthur to the notary, and then to me. They were clearly not expecting this. "What's going on, Rebecca?" my father asked, his voice attempting a tone of paternal authority that now sounded utterly pathetic to my ears. "Is this about the company? We should have been included in this." "Please sit," I said, my voice ringing with a newfound power. I gestured to the 2 empty chairs on the opposite side of the table. They sat, looking like defendants at their own trial. The show was about to begin.